Hello there, you awakening wonders. Thanks for joining me for Stay Free with Russell Brand. For our special edition, we always dedicate the whole show to a special guest, and it's an exciting one today. Wherever you're watching this, you can only see the whole show exclusively on Rumble. After 10 minutes, we click over exclusive so that free speech can flow, because today we're talking to Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Chris Hedges.
They cannot win a war of attrition.
America has been continually engaged in conflict.
What is the goal of the war in Ukraine?
Chris spent nearly 2 decades as a correspondent reporting in over 50 countries.
Russia has bled profusely, but a war of attrition Ukraine can't win.
Today we're going to be talking about the perpetual state of war.
We have 800 bases around the globe. There has to be a massive retraction.
The repackaging of these conflicts that has changed, the marketing of these wars.
After World War II, you had a perpetuation of what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex.
We'll be talking about the escalation of conflict between Western nations and China, the impossibility of alliances outside of centralized establishment politics, and when the liberal left went wrong. Stay free with Russell Brand. See it first on Rumble. Thanks for joining us, Chris. It's lovely to talk to you again.
Thanks, Russell.
Chris, we get straight into this new permanent war state that we appear to be living in. It felt like during the 60s, when there was the Vietnam conflict and the Korea Wars, that this was a period that had been committed to history, that there was no appetite to see American bodies returning home posthumously. But since then, it seems that, America has been continually engaged in conflict, and it's the repackaging of these conflicts that has changed, the marketing of these wars. Why is it that there is a necessity, whether it's Afghanistan, Ukraine, or a potential forthcoming Taiwan-oriented conflict between the US and China, that there appears to be a necessity for ongoing conflicts? Is it built into the American economic model? Why is it necessary, and why is it so difficult to get balanced reporting around this subject, Chris?
Yes, it's completely built into the American economic model, as Seymour Melman, the scholar at Columbia, pointed out in books like The Permanent War Economy. So after World War II, you had a perpetuation of the military, what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, and it justified itself through the Cold War, although it created nuclear arsenals that could wipe out Soviet cities 10 times over. And then, of course, it fed the proxy wars that were very much part of the Cold War. I spent 5 years covering the war in El Salvador, for instance, in the early 1980s. But Vietnam was a very seminal point because you're right. The American middle class did not want their kids coming home in body bags. And so there were 2 things that happened after Vietnam. One, there was a kind of reckoning that the country asked questions about themselves, or we did as Americans, that we hadn't asked before. There was a kind of, let's call it a period of 10 or 15 years of anti-militarism because of the Vietnam War, which then Ronald Reagan attempted to, I think, successfully restore the quote-unquote good name of war. The other thing is that the military or the militarists realized that they had to abolish the draft, that if they were going to continue the policy of permanent war, they were going to have to fight it with poor kids who didn't have any options and comprised a small, largely powerless demographic within the country in the single digits in terms of percentages. Much of my own family on my mother's side comes from rural Maine, and they are the classic cannon fodder for the military. Unfortunately, I would also add, they're quite susceptible to the propaganda, the flag-waving, gun-toting. I'm talking about my own family, but that's another issue. So those 2 things happened, and that allowed them to continue with war. Now, I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. I was in Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Romania, 1989. So I was there with the collapse of the Soviet Union and acutely aware of the promises that have been made to Gorbachev not to expand NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany. In fact, we were all talking about the peace dividend, which shows you how naive we all were, believing that there would not be this necessity to commit such large quantities of money, material, research, and human capital into the war industry. Well, the war industry had no intention of going away. That's why it pushed the expansion of NATO, although, of course, as I think you've mentioned on your show, the promises were made not to do. There was a violation of the promises made to Moscow. And I think that expansion of NATO was pushed for two reasons. One, it made the arms industry billions in profits because countries, Poland, et cetera, had to reconfigure their militaries to be compatible with NATO equipment, but also hubris. That's when the United States began to talk about the unipolar world, which is just a fancy way of saying we dominate. Whatever we do, we can do anything we want and nobody can get in our way. Those two things led to the conflict with Ukraine. And just to close, I think that there's a deep understanding now certainly within the U.S. military, that they cannot win a war of attrition against Russia. Russia has bled and bled profusely, no question. But a war of attrition, Ukraine can't win. And I was in the first Gulf War. I was in southern Iraq after the war. I was in the Shiite uprising in Basra, and then I was taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard. But being there, we had no clean water, we had no electricity, the schools were bombed, were destroyed, the hospitals were destroyed. That is a classic tactic that the U.S. military uses. It's what the Russians are using, and that's why you see this panic and sending M1 Abrams tanks. We can talk about that later, which will be largely useless. Talking about uranium-depleted weapons, now you have, through Poland, lobbying to send F-15, F-16 fighter jets. Very, very dangerous. But of course, as we saw with Afghanistan, it doesn't matter whether they can win. The Washington Post published the Afghan papers, which illustrated that the military and political leadership in the United States knew, at best, Afghanistan would be a stalemate. But the war went on for many years. This was also true in Vietnam, because war is a business, very lucrative. Raytheon, Halliburton, Northrop Grumman, etc. And we just have been unable to push back against this militarism that is disemboweling the country. If you drive across the United States, our cities and towns and communities are just desolate.
If you're watching us on YouTube now, we are only going to be with you there for another couple of minutes before we click over to being exclusively on Rumble, because I'm going to be asking Chris about the reconstruction of Ukraine, in particular the role of BlackRock and JP Morgan, and the Ukraine as investment opportunity narrative. Also, we'll be talking about how the left has become irrelevant, in Chris Hedges' own words. So do remember to click the link in the description. Join us on Rumble. Even better, join us on Locals. You'll get all sorts of extra content. The military method as a sort of raison d'etre and determining ideology of establishment power means that, in spite of apparent bipartisan politics, essentially what you have is a